I will now ask Jean-Pierre Sarthou to join us. So, Jean-Pierre Sarthou is a professor at the National Polytechnic Institute of Toulouse at ENSAT. He is a researcher at INRAE. We now say DRAHE on a theme that led him to conservation agriculture, which is the agroecological protection of crops. And in fact, from crop protection, Jean-Pierre, it seemed obvious to you that it was necessary that everything started in the soil. That's the subject. And as a result, you measured things. And now we are going to objectively look at some quite interesting things between what happens in conservation agriculture and what happens in conventional agriculture.
There you go. So, hello everyone. It's true that for a long time I hadn't planned to talk about this, but since I'm apparently going to clarify everything very quickly, for a very long time I worked on beneficial insects, how we could promote beneficial insects in agricultural plots. And then I realized that sometimes the landscape was far from explaining everything and that there was something we didn't control, that we didn't know well. And that apparently was related to the soil. And personally, I also became interested in conservation agriculture about 12 or 13 years ago. Well, I've been interested in it for 12 or 13 years.
And you teach it? Yes, I teach it.
I also tried to talk about strength because you told me earlier. Yes, and ultimately I'm still interested in crop protection, but by trying to understand what role the soil plays in it. So I need to talk to you about innovative systems. Where are we today in terms of advantages and disadvantages that innovative systems present? And it's true that in terms of the importance of soil and the new soil management, it's in large-scale farming that we have the most experience. In this approach, it's that of soil conservation agriculture. And I will talk to you about the agroecological performance of SCA. So, in conventional agriculture, as you know, there is intensive soil tillage, and added to that, sometimes long periods of bare soil. We note in passing that ploughing, as we see here, does not completely solve the problem of weeds. We will talk about it again. The consequence of this is severe soil erosion all over the world. You see, every year we lose about 12, 13 million hectares of agricultural land in any case that are severely degraded. This leads to the following situation today. More than 50% of agricultural soils are degraded to very degraded. Here is an illustration, the mouth of the Adour in 2014. Globally, it's about 26 billion tons of arable soils that are carried into the oceans each year. If we could recover this soil, spread it over 25 to 30 centimeters, it would create an area of about 7 million hectares. This is just to represent the amount of soil or fine earth that leaves the agricultural plots. It's not about a disappearance. In absolute terms, it's about a thinning of agricultural soils, and thus we end up with a loss of fertility due to loss of soil depth due to the erosion we just talked about. And we see that here you have the soil depth. The deeper the soil going to the right, the higher the yields. So this is a generic diagram. It synthesizes everything we know about the importance of soil depth in relation to their fertility, their capacity to produce quintals. So the deeper the soils, the easier the harvest quintals, or whether with inputs or without inputs below. But conversely, the more soil depth is lost, the more superficial the soils become, the less is harvested. And we are forced to apply quite a lot of fertilizer to harvest less anyway. However, in soil conservation agriculture, it involves establishing one crop after another without any soil tillage, at least in its strictest form, let's say. So no soil tillage to transition from one crop to another. As a result, erosion is almost non-existent. We can't say it's non-existent. It's a natural phenomenon. We can never bring it to zero, but it is greatly reduced, and we can say close to or even equal to the rate of soil formation, which is indeed very slow. In conventional agriculture, again, another negative aspect, as we mentioned, there is a lot of soil tillage, the use of fertilizers, pesticides, bare soils, birds. Some birds take advantage of this to feed. And, as a result, as we saw with Mikkel, there is a loss of biodiversity, which I call macro-mesosoil biodiversity. The macro, roughly speaking, refers to earthworms, mesobiodiversity. It's all the small invertebrates that Mikkel showed us. And indeed, it is in conservation agriculture systems, ACS, that we have the maximum number of earthworms per square meter across different categories. Well, not in all cases, but in most cases, we have more earthworms, more nematodes in conservation agriculture systems than in organic and conventional agriculture.
Quantity and quality?
So in terms of quantity and quality, in biomass especially, since we're talking about grams per square meter, it's about the number of individuals per 100 grams. So here it's about biomass or the number of individuals. As for quality, I think it's Michael who should be asked the question. I could talk a little more about it, but I preferred not to delve into that aspect. In any case, the fact that there is more biomass or individuals means there is a much greater biologically originated porosity, which has high pore continuity. Obviously, these organisms dig tunnels, they move around. So it's connected porosity. It's a strong continuity in the soil. And this bioporosity almost disappears from tilled soils. In conservation agriculture under mulch, you could say it's the good life. So there are quite a few earthworms, and this translates very concretely into the fact that earthworms, as we have seen previously, are capable, starting from a situation where the soil has been compacted. This is soil. Under the wheels of Fenderellis, on a trailer path, on a silage site in a few months, you see the earthworms are capable of recreating tunnels. So they create bioporosity, I repeat, with high pore continuity, which, by the way, can be used by plant roots to penetrate deeper. But we will see that this high bioporosity with pore continuity, really important, has a very significant effect in terms of water flow speed. In conventional agriculture, we can also lose, due to these practices, we can lose there significantly the soil microbiodiversity, which nevertheless contributed to the strong cohesion between aggregates. And when you place a clod from an agricultural plot under conventional management in a wire basket, in a soil column, at the top of a soil column, it's the famous Slake test. You see, it disintegrates very quickly. The aggregates have very weak cohesion between them. The soil disintegrates and ends up accumulating at the bottom and top of the soil column. In conservation agriculture, there's more carbon in return combined with no tillage. Well, we promote this micro biodiversity, that's what we see here. It's indeed in CA, in conservation agriculture, that there is the maximum biomass, bacteria, fungi. For a very long time, I return to a point that was mentioned earlier. For a very long time, we thought it was specified by Marc-André. We thought that ploughing favored the specific diversity of bacteria. And in fact, it's true when we compare ploughing to young systems of agriculture and conservation. But there is a publication, I didn't include it here, which shows that when we compare the specific diversity of bacterial communities, again, between ploughing and conservation agriculture systems, but older conservation agriculture systems, at that moment, conservation agriculture not only has more biomass, but also has more diversity, more specific richness, but these are older systems. So there is a publication, in any case, one that demonstrates this, which would tend to show that in conservation agriculture, older systems, we can surpass the bacterial diversity, supposedly, which was the highest in ploughing. But at that moment, we need to focus, I repeat, on well-established systems. So, in a soil sample from a conservation agriculture system, there is a strong biological activity. This has already been discussed. Including mycorrhizal fungi, we see these small networks, these very clear filaments. There is also glomalin, since these mycelial fungi synthesize glomalin. These are biological glues. It's all this light green halo that spreads and permeates the aggregates, the fine soil particles. These are biological glues, which are also synthesized by bacteria. They also synthesize other biological glues. These are not glomalins, of course. But in any case, all these biological glues contribute to aggregating the particles of soil among themselves, thus creating aggregates that on average are larger in size than in a soil tillage system. And this gives very good structural stability to the aggregates in agriculture and conservation. You see a clod of earth has been placed in the same basket in a soil column. Well, the water is absolutely not contaminated, clouded. It is perfectly clear, no turbidity in this water. So, yes, the last thing that appears here is the mulch. Since the soil is no longer tilled, the mulch accumulates on the surface. So in conservation agriculture systems, ACS, we have mulch on the surface, we have a strong microbial biomass. As we have seen, we have quite a few biopores that are with a strong pore continuity. The result of all this is a very significant increase in the hydraulic conductivity at saturation. What is this? It is the ability of water to move through the macroporosity. We saturate the soil, so the microporosity, obviously, but also the mesoporosity are filled with water, and then we add more water to see how it moves through the macroporosity. In a conservation agriculture system, ACS, it circulates the best. The rate is therefore more than 120 times higher in ACS than in conventional agriculture. Obviously, the consequence of this is a much better infiltration rate of rainwater, thus reducing runoff and erosion in well-managed ACS systems, because it's not automatic. You can have surface closure of porosity, and at that point, the rate in ACS can sometimes be equivalent to what we have in conventional systems, or even lower than what we have in conventional agriculture. It's not because we stop working the soil, and sometimes even leave the residues on the surface if there aren't enough residues. If we don't ensure the calcium maintenance of the soil, we can have a closure of surface porosity and as a result have very poor soil structure, even though we are supposedly in conservation agriculture systems, but not in good conservation agriculture systems. Well, the result is where you have on the left a field in conventional farming and on the right a conservation agriculture system for about 15 years. It's at Frederick Thomas's place, for those who know him. Well, the soil is very degraded on the surface, unstructured. You have the formation of a crust on the left, whereas on the right, you can see that the surface is not at all the same. The wheat is at the same stage. Obviously, water infiltrates much better on the right than on the left. That's clear. There you go. But here, it is a well-managed conservation agriculture system. Well, some other advantages of the conservation agriculture system now. And notably in terms of adaptation to climate change will increasingly impose episodes of drought or heat waves on us. And so with this climate change, it is interesting to increase and improve the soil's available water capacity or the soil's useful reservoir, which is its ability to store water that is then useful for plants. And so here is an experiment that demonstrated that after 6 years of conservation agriculture system, we had, these are the dark gray bars at different depths. We had the creation of mesoporosity, which is the porosity that stores useful water for plants. We had the creation of mesoporosity, and thus it is what makes the available water capacity, the soil's useful reservoir. We had a doubling of this available water capacity in the soils thanks to the conservation agriculture system.
And this, regardless of whether the soil is more or less sandy or clay, have you considered this in different situations that might...
Deeply. So obviously, we reserve this useful capacity. Of course, obviously, there is a part of the available water capacity when, regarding the soil, here it is a matter of a even, deeply, infer the available water capacity. From studies around the world that compared the evolution of the available water capacity in a conventional tillage system and what it becomes, this available water capacity, or what this useful reservoir becomes when transitioning to conservation agriculture system, to see the rate at which this available water capacity evolves depending on the soil texture. Once we switch to conservation agriculture system, we don't have enough hindsight, but one thing's certain, it's that when we move from a conventional tillage system to a well-managed conservation agriculture system, regardless of the soil texture, we improve the available water capacity. Simply because, and here we refer back to Mickelhead's presentation, simply because we promote the microfauna, which includes small nematodes and protozoa, because the microfauna is capable of creating mesoporosity. This porosity, a particular range, porosity between 0.2 and 50 microns, is this porosity that stores the water useful for plants. So, in conservation agriculture systems, we indeed create mesoporosity. We improve the available water capacity, as we can see here. So we have better water functioning of the soils, better water efficiency of the rains. As we saw earlier, we promote the infiltration of water of rains, and then we promote its storage. And through the presence of mycorrhizae, we facilitate its use. So that's why during drought periods, as we will see later, crops in conservation agriculture systems withstand water stress periods much better. In ACS, we can further improve water economy. How? By preventing soil heating. Here you have different temperature evolution curves. Let's look at the largest difference, which is between a bare-tilled soil, thus bare, and a non-tilled soil covered with mulch. In ACS, we have a difference of 6.5 degrees C. I didn't write it down, but it's at a depth of 5 cm. In Brazil, in Argentina, they have conducted other measurements that are even more spectacular than this one. Well, the soil heats up less, and as a result, it loses less water. You see, in ACS, we lose 0.6 millimeter per day. That's what they measured in conventional farming after each tillage, 4 millimeter per day. Well, then, one might say yes. So what? The consequence of that, well, already, after a week, it's 4.2 meteo. In the first case, it's 28 in the second case. Well, yes, and so, well, you just have to compare that with what is allowed, or the amount of data needed to produce a ton of dry matter. For all plant species combined is roughly 25 millimelos to produce a ton of dry matter. In the second case, we lost in 1 week the potential to feed, produce, allow the production, the formation of a ton of dry matter. This is what a summer cover could have allowed. And that, it's a loss in 1 week. So a soil that heats up loses a lot of water. And we are not sufficiently aware of this in France. I can assure you that in Brazil and Argentina, they are fully aware of it. And they are very careful about this to retain the water that has been stored in the soil. Well, so we were talking about adaptation. Now we are going to talk about mitigation. Regarding climate change, earlier you said, or Marc-André said, that agriculture is often presented as a problem. But it can also be a solution to the problem, especially in relation to climate change. Indeed, it can mitigate this climate change by reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases, firstly through carbon storage in the atmosphere. There is too much CO2. When plants capture this CO2, incorporate it into biomass, and this biomass is transformed into humus, when we let this biomass decompose on the soil surface, the humus can be stored in the soil. And there, the values that will be revealed, conveyed by scientific literature, are very, very variable. You see, it ranges from 200 kilos to more than a ton. It depends on the scientific publications. So it depends on the performance of the ACS systems that have been studied. That was in the horizon. Geotrit. And below, in the 3,000 centimeter horizon, there are indeed publications then, in bold and underlined. These are bibliographic syntheses or meta-analyses which have said that, well, no, some have even gone so far as to say that deep storage was very limited, even non-existent, and then others, you see recent publications, they reach more than a ton 150 stored per hectare per year. Stored between 30 cm and 1 meter depth. So it's really a very, very difficult subject. This amount of carbon that can be stored per hectare per year, depending on the depth, but we realize that it depends greatly on the quality of the ACS system being studied. The 4 per 1,000 is doable then. It's very doable, very much so. If you could have next to me, by a wave of a magic wand, Pascal Boigneville, who is a researcher, a Swiss pedologist, studies all this by taking measurements So he does not use satellite images to assess the amount of carbon stored in the soil. He takes measurements at farmers' places, takes soil samples, calculates the percentage of organic matter in his soil samples, taking into account the soil's bulk density, of course, to calculate the dynamics of carbon storage in soils at different depths depending on the cropping systems. And he comes to the conclusion that the 4 per 1,000 initiative is not even very ambitious. He has plots at farmers' places where it is 3 to 4 times higher than that in terms of the amount of carbon stored in the soil. In any case, whatever the situation, we understand well that all these researchers are not in agreement with each other, but we have understood well. One thing is that the keystone of carbon storage in the form of humus in the soil is the combination of no-till practices and a large input of biomass, quite en élève. Either one, taken separately, does not work. All right. It's not because we stop tilling the soil that we will store carbon. On the contrary, if we stop tilling the soil and there is not enough biomass added to the soil might in the end produce less and less, and I am well positioned. To say this, well, the soil, even though it is not tilled, can release carbon. When you talk about adding biomass, is it biomass produced on-site or brought in? It can be both. And actually, we realized that to kickstart the process, it's better to bring in exogenous biomass. So to kickstart the process, we can add compost. But once the soil is functioning well, the compost should be left for others. And it's biomass produced on site. And we can produce 15, 20, 22 tons of dry matter per hectare per year in our temperate systems. Some even exceed that. So we can add a lot of biomass to the soil. Once it is functioning well, now, mitigation, by always reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases, but we will look at CO2 emissions, nitrous oxide, which Marc-André started talking about earlier, and CH4. By the way, nitrous oxide, just a small note, it's the famous laughing gas. That's the one. It's a natural molecule, as we saw earlier, but starting with CO2. In ACS, we significantly reduce fossil CO2 emissions. Quite simply, what is fossil CO2? It's CO2 in which the carbon a few months earlier was in a fossil energy source, coal or oil. Quite simply, because in ACS we benefit from significant fuel savings since farming operations are much less extensive, there is no more plowing, less power is used, and less frequently. Reduction of contemporary CO2 emissions, quite simply because there is a decrease in the rate of mineralization of soil organic matter. This can be a disadvantage. Sometimes it's a disadvantage, this decrease in the rate of mineralization of soil organic matter for the establishment of spring crops. Because the soils warm up less, there can be a delay in the start of the crop because of this. But in terms of CO2 emissions, it's an advantage. Now, the emissions of CH4 and N2O also decrease because there is this reduced mineralization of organic matter, the famous K2 that you must know, but there is an improvement in ACS of activity and an increase in the biomass of microbial populations. So that's why there is an emission, a reduction in these emissions, while most publications, including this one, related to the famous long-term trial in Boigneville, report in ACS an increase in N2O emissions. Well, actually today, we are beginning to understand why several publications comparing tillage and ACS show that ACS causes higher N2O emissions. It's because it involves ACS. The ACS systems studied are incomplete systems. We always arrive at the same conclusion. The proof is here. In the USA, after 30 years of well-managed ACS with high biomass production, there is a 40% reduction in N2O emissions compared to plowing, and 57% compared to chiseling. So why such a difference between plowing and chiseling? The authors are not entirely sure of the explanation. But in any case, see that when we focus on a well-established system that has been in place for a long time and is very efficient, an ACS system, it is possible to have lower N2O emissions in ACS than in a system with soil tillage. It's rare. This is not the case with these 3 publications. In these 3 publications, there are more N2O emissions in ACS than in plowing. Well, so we return to previous known situations, which for some confirm the fact that ACS emits more N2O, but it's not automatic, as we have just seen here. Nevertheless, by studying the net global warming potential of these ACS systems, there are indeed more N2O emissions, but there are fewer CO2 and CH4 emissions. Which means that, all things considered, these decreases outweigh this increase. So overall, in these three studied systems, in ACS, there is a very significant reduction in the net global warming potential, thanks to the reductions in CO2 and CH4. So it's not as dramatic as it seems that sometimes there is an increase in N2O emissions. So we continue. Better environmental preservation through... We give ourselves 5 more minutes. All right, I will speed up through a reduced use of pesticides in ACS. We observe in a very classic way a reduction or even a cessation of fungicides because there is a clear decrease in diseases. Olivier will talk to us about it. The pH redox couple is much less favorable to phytopathogenic agents. Another explanation is that the mulch, and which is much less known, the mulch, while decomposing on the soil surface, emits volatile organic compounds that are antagonistic to IFS and fungal disease inocular present on crop residues. And this has been demonstrated for these 3 diseases. So it's a kind of biological control enabled by volatile organic compounds from the decomposing mulch, a reduction or even cessation of insecticides with a clear decrease in pests. There are several possible explanations for this. Italians have shown that ACS promotes beneficial organisms, thus compensating for the negative effects of simplified landscapes. We think it's a hypothesis to explain what we have observed, that ACS would favor, and this is indeed conditional, the emissions of HIPV, which are also volatile organic compounds, molecules signaling plants being attacked, devoured by pests. The beneficial organisms detect them to come to protect and feed on the pests on these plants. We think that plants, all other things being equal, moreover, if they grow in soil that suits them better, thus in ACS, they are more likely to emit these olfactory signals. Well, regarding slugs, ACS favors slugs, but sometimes there is a reduction in damage. What we have observed but have not published is that there is a change in population after a certain number of years. The more phytophagous slugs are replaced by slugs that are less phytophagous and more detritivorous, thus less problematic for crops. We verified this with isotopic analyses, carbon, nitrogen. We haven't published it because we haven't had the time. What a shame. A very important point also is that there can be a reduction in the use of herbicides in conservation agriculture systems, ACS. Contrary to what many people claim, in poorly managed systems, this is the case. But in well-managed systems, there can be a reduction in herbicides because there is less emergence of weeds after sowing. There is an increase in the predation of weed seeds by seed-eating insects, but also by earthworms, anisic, and endogic species. And the result is that after 3 years, without the introduction of new weed seeds, all other things being equal. Furthermore, the density of weeds in a conservation agriculture system, ACS plot, decreases by 80% compared to a plot in a conventional tillage system. Thus, we achieve a reduction, a lesser use of herbicides in a well-established conservation agriculture system, ACS, which quickly becomes comparable to, or even lower than, it's possible lower than, the conventional system. On the other hand, in direct seeding alone, obviously, it's quite the opposite. I'll move on. Very quickly on this, reduction of herbicide losses because there is less erosion, less runoff, less soil loss. Thus, there is less loss of active ingredients, such as isoproteron, terbutylazine, or metolachlor. So, we've known this for quite some time now. Better degradation of pesticide residues. Well, I'll move on. The few pesticides that are still used, since organic ACS does not exist, are better degraded in the soils. Be careful, sometimes there can be a direct connection between the surface and the groundwater table. Through the galleries of anisic earthworms, so caution is needed, but this is not often the case. And especially the macroporosity is not systematically used by rainwater when it rains. Well, it's This too is known now for a short time, but this connection is relatively rare. Better retention of all pesticide residues on organic matter, thus reducing the concentration of herbicides in drainage waters. ACS also promotes ordinary biodiversity. Here skylark, corn bunting, yellow wagtail. There are more in the ACS system than in the system. Plowing without cover with a bit of herbicide, and the worst being direct seeding without cover, but since there is no plowing, there is a lot of herbicide, so that's the worst. It's not because it's direct seeding that it's virtuous, far from it. So it's the CS that fared the best. This is the last slide. What about it? No, it's not the last one, sorry. So, in terms of productivity, these are results from experimental plots. You see, it's a meta-analysis, less than 2.5%. When this publication came out, the American farmers were not happy. They explain on their site there are 29 reasons why. They observe better productivity on their own farms compared to their neighbors. But here, these are experimental plots, and they explain in 29 points why you cannot compare what happens in agricultural plots, in real life, let's say, to systems, micro plots in experimental plots. Despite everything, this meta-analysis highlighted an increase in ACS yields with the age of the systems and especially higher yields in ACS compared to conventional in context of water stress. This is confirmed by numerous studies in Europe and around the world. It can go up to more than 120 in very dry climates. Better yield stability, whether outside of climatic accidents or following periods of water stress in particular. There is better stability, better resilience of systems in ACS. For economic profitability, almost everywhere in Europe, better profitability, reduced labor costs, fuel expenses, maintenance costs, and material machinery expenses. So this is the last slide. So does it only have advantages? Obviously not. And above all, these are not easy systems to manage. Despite everything, 2 multi-criteria studies show, for one, ACS plus 4 other agroecological systems compared, all 5, therefore, compared to a conventional system for 8 ecosystem services. ACS performs better than the conventional system for 7 out of the 8. And regarding the 4 other agroecological systems, well, they perform better than the conventional system. There, for 2 out of 8 services, 5 out of 8, 4 out of 8, 4 out of 8, there you go. And the last publication, the second one, is a multi-criteria study. ACS systems, in the strict or broad sense, were compared to organic and conventional systems, and therefore 17 ecosystem services, 7 inputs, regulation supports, and 10 environmental agricultural products. I'll go into the details. If you have the time to read, that's great. But overall, it's not the ACS that wins every time, but it's the CS that wins most of the time. And so in conclusion, the CS, yes, we come to the conclusion that it presents the best potential to combat the well-known antagonism that exists between productivity and environmental performance. So you understand that it's important to look at what's happening below the soil. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Jean-Pierre Sarthou. We're starting to set the scene well.